probably, from investor, from a VC standpoint, probably the very first thing on investors looking at open source, I think, is adoption. I mean, adoption and contribution. I mean, and another thing which we really always look into, is the strategy of open source products regarding free versus paid. So how the company structure it, what should be.
So, hi to all our listeners. This is another episode of SourceLife, and today we are hosting Igor Kotua. So, before Igor will present himself, we have also with us Tomer Barnea, the CEO and founder of Novu, and myself. My name is Emilian Pierce, and I'm the DevRel for Novu. And just a quick background for Igor. Igor is an analyst for RunaCapital. RunaCapital mainly focusing on investing in open source companies, but I don't really want to elaborate on this. I prefer to give Igor the stage to do it. So, Igor, please welcome and tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. So I'm Igor from RunaCapital. It's like a VC firm investing across United States and Europe. So before joining Runa, I was like a developer, technical guy. I was trying to make like a small media startup around newsletter startups and other stuff. And yeah, this is how actually I got into like venture capital. And now because I have like experience in this development, I'm focusing on open source and other technical stuff in Runa. Yeah, I have like bachelor degree in physics and aeroacoustics. Probably you've never heard about it. So yeah, I mean, happy to be here.
Okay. It was like you said, like it was nothing. Like it's just a side note. Um, but okay, so before we will actually continue, and we also okay, actually, Tomer, just say hi so everybody will hear that you're actually
Hello,
here.
hello. Hey there,
Yeah,
Tom
I think
Barnea, CEO of Novu.
so. The first thing that I probably would like us to tackle, guys, and of course, I believe that you have much more to contribute to this subject with both of your backgrounds. So, what kind of product? This is like the first question. What kind of products are suitable for open source? This is like straightforward, but I want you just to take it and grab it from here. I mean, Tomer, you probably can start, and then Igor, you can add everything else you want.
Sure. So I think first thing first is you need to define a bit better what is a product and what goes really nicely for open source. I would start by saying that everything that is fundamentally low-level infrastructure, like might be just a library, maybe some sort of a protocol, like ORMs did, something like that. Those are very good in open source. They tend to be extremely technical by nature. Usually, there's no way to kind of pass it on to any other individual other than an engineers or highly technical individuals. And so those are really good at open source because that way you can kind of work with the open source community, learn about the actual problem, and most often than not, it is what you can say is a pure open source. There's no commercial part of it. It's there for for the sake of being out there and making engineers' life easier. More of a product like Novu, but there are a tremendous lot of other solutions are not as easily good for open source. I think the basic merit of it should be: is it fundamentally a very technical product by nature? Is it solving very high, complex technical issues for technical people? If the answer for those two questions is yes, then there is some merit to give that to as an open source kind of solution. Because again, that way, more and more technical people, more and more technical individuals could engage with the solution, give suggestions, say what they need, how they need that, and help develop and bring this solution to become kind of the de facto solution for the open source engineering community. So that's for me kind of what should be out there. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Trim Left. It's a nice library, but to be frank, I mean, I don't know.
Okay, Igor, what are your thoughts? I mean, what actually products or services are suitable to be open source?
Yeah, obviously, open source like started from around developers because it's like natural way. I mean, for the engineers to work with code which we can actually see. Yeah, and all like obvious products are started around developers, like infrastructure, like dev tools. I know infrastructure like everything from databases to I don't know like the search engines and other kind of tools and something like dev tools which I know I think like easiest makes the development easier. I don't know like scaffolding, maybe deployment easier, and these kind of products are actually very natural to make them open source. But I think it's a little bit. It started from this point, but I think it's now starting a little bit to democratizing also in other areas. So there are emerging other open source products
Right.
which are not so technical people focused already, even focusing even on they still quite technical, they still require engineers to deploy them, etc. But the end user, for instance, already can be not a technical person. For
Uh,
instance, yeah.
So one thing that I think we could and maybe even should slightly touch here is because we comparing SaaS companies and open source companies, I think it would be really appropriate also to bring up the monetization kind of aspect of it. So if you just maybe
Yeah, I can start. About monetization. So I think there are a couple of different ways for open source products to do that, and the most basic one, like the most open source products. Free version. The free versions are not, designed to work in a real, enterprise environment. So like they not have these all enterprise great features like I don't know single sign on and a role level access and other different features that are really important for
Mhm,
enterprises. And this is probably like the simplest way to monetize a product. Just the open kind of open core model. Then you have all the basic functionality free, and you have this all features which are really make sense for big companies in a paid tier. And this
mhm.
is this is like the one of those examples of like monetization. Another one can be, for instance, something. It's not like probably the best one, but something like a bottleneck. So I think like then the open source product, is not so scalable. So for instance, it's built, with technologies which enough, to handle. Medium workload, but if you're going, I don't know, to thousands of millions of I don't know requests, etc., then it wouldn't be able to handle it. And this also makes sense to yeah to make these features paid and distributed and yeah and the third one probably is just something like managed service. So then people just
mhm.
don't want to think about managing
Right.
infrastructure for open source for the product itself. You just maybe it's like the paid version even can have feature parity with the free product, but it's just kind of managed in the cloud so that
Managed.
you don't need to worrying updating it, etc. Yeah. But there's probably not all like the ways of monetization, but yeah, maybe Tomer can add something here.
So first of all, we need to make sure we know that talking about open source companies and B2B, not B2B, but I would say SaaS offering. Most often than not, if you look kind of if you zoom out and look at the playbook, then open source playbook ends up being enterprise sales or SaaS
Yeah.
offering, right? Most often than not, at
Oh,
least these days, right? 20 years back, it would look like open source, and then it ends up being on-prem. So
yeah.
at the end of the day, it looks rather similar to normal product companies. With that being said, The first couple of years tend to be vastly different. The actual matrices for growing the companies are vastly different. Um, and you do have one type of hop in open source companies that you don't have in traditional product companies. That is the open source community and the open source usage. And so that hop you need to make sure you master correctly. And just like Igor said, these days I think the biggest differentiation and this, or the easiest one would be, do I need to host and manage this? And in simple solution, you might choose to do that. But I mean, if you look at solutions like N8N or Postog or Novu, the actual infrastructure beneath it tends to be so complex. No one actually wants to host it, right? And I can share
Yeah.
specifically about Novu since our, and Emil can testify about that as well. Since we started, like every week, we're getting people asking us, can we get this, or at least we used to get this up until we hosted it. Can we get this in a hosted version? Because at the end of the day, it tends to be a very complicated system to not only to deploy but to actually maintain. And then the other kind of easy, non-complicated way to create divergence between the two versions is enterprise-grade needs, right? Like audits, logs, SSO, permissions, whatever that may be that your product does. Those are really clear distinction, and I think what you can say quite easily is if something is not necessarily for the engineers, then you don't necessarily need to give it for free. Because again, it doesn't give any added benefit for the engineer.
Yeah.
I mean, no engineer would say, I have this small project I'm trying to run to learn GraphQL, and I would love to use Postog to get analytics. But, I have to put, like 30 different type of permissions. I have to have
Yeah.
it. And no one thinks like that. That is an enterprise need.
Yeah, I think there
Um,
is also a little bit different model, a kind of hybrid model, I would say. Than, for instance, something like front end frameworks like Gatsby JS. Then basically
mhm,
the all core product is open source. I mean, all the library you can build it, all the website with all this nice feature like server side rendering, GraphQL APIs, all
right.
this kind of stuff, and it's free. You can go and then just deploy it whenever you like on Netlify and Vercel. But there is also a very there is also like hosting by Gatsby. Then you just type in a CLI Gatsby deploy, and it's deployed in its life. And so I mean, it's a little bit different. It's mostly about DevOps, but it's also about you know developer experience, how easy and
Right.
nice it is. Yeah, so this also a little bit drives a revenue option and revenue for them. And for instance, there is some products. For instance, maybe good example would be a product called LiveBlocks. It allows to build Figma-like multiplayer experiences. So it's basically open source library that you integrate in your code base. Yeah, but also it
Mhm,
has a backend infrastructure which handles all this multiplayer syncing and other stuff. And so, I mean, you
mhm.
can deploy this backend by your own. They also have this open source part. Yeah, but still, I mean, some people would do that, but it's a very very I mean a lot of challenges here and hassle to do that. But still, like so it's kind of hybrid. You have the open source library and you have a backend, and yeah, I mean, basically Novel
Uh,
is also similar to that, but it's just a little bit perspective on this.
Yeah, I think more generally speaking, looking into open source companies and how they're able to kind of, you mentioned earlier about open core and open source. Just to give kind of quick, note about it, then open core is the amount of basically the percentage of what you're keeping for yourself. Basically, that's the company's IP. Now it might be source available, but it's nothing free about it. It's not open source by license. It means the company holds this code as their own, and it's considered their own IP, right? Every other thing, free game, you can do whatever you want. That's by license. And that's regardless of is the source code actually available or not, right? So just to give us about that. But when you're looking into this motion of, what I'm giving for free, what I'm giving availability, and what I'm actually hosting, at the end of the day, if you stay true to the actual engineer's needs, then as a company, you're able to learn regardless of your ability to actually earn money out of it, regardless of the actual monetization. And most often than not, if an enterprise chose to implement your own solution as an internal solution, right? So they actually deployed everything and they have 2, 3 engineers working on that full-time job. Then the company would be the first one to approach for support and services. So
Yeah.
even then, even in the scenario where the company was chosenly opted out from the business, they're still going to be the first one to contact if the need rises. So
Yeah.
the actual commercial motion keeps on working.
No, I
But I
mean, because
think,
you probably you know your code like better than others, so you could provide a better support than anyone else. I mean,
yeah,
and
but I think,
also, yeah. I mean, just also
uh,
also wanted to mention that like there is an interesting trend, like, and probably for instance, Open Replay, they have like paid version, enterprise version, which is self-hosted, but it's also source available, so they don't, this enterprise features they also open source. They also,
yeah,
I mean, it's just in
source
different ways.
available, not open source.
Yeah, it's source available. Yeah, it's right word for that. So it has a different license, but you still can see how it works, understand what's inside there.
Yeah,
You can influence that, and yeah, so it's
and,
they don't try to hide this functionality from everyone else.
I would like to try to switch gears a bit and right now maybe to touch a different, not entirely different kind of area, but Igor, I know that you own a library in over GitHub, which basically there you gathering many different kind of open source alternatives to SaaS companies. And before we will actually dig and touch that in more depth, I would like maybe to talk about the existing and emerging open source kind of categories and trends that you see as a person that kind of look closely into this motion.
Yeah, I mean, general motion that I see, and which is quite interesting, I think. So, I mean, if you go back, a little bit into history, into start of open source movement, it's basically, as we already said, it's everything started around engineers, right, and around developers, tech people, and now with products like Passhawk and Open Replay, and there is a new kind of market segment which attracts new users to actually try open source product, which users are non-technical. I mean, so it's
Mhm.
the I mean, still these products involve technical people to deploy them and bring to the companies, but the end users are non-technical, and which is this is something which is new about this market segment. So it's actually becoming bigger because not only technical people are involved in its products. And now I see that it's even going a little bit more extreme than we see some companies, open source companies starting with desktop apps, with open source desktop apps, like for instance Athens Research, which is doing open source ROM research, which is basically note taking tool. You can just
Mm,
okay.
okay.
install it on your laptop and start using it, and as a single person, as a kind of B2C product. And also
Mhm.
OpenBB, which is doing investment terminal, which is also a desktop app which you download on your laptop and start using. So it's and Space Drive, for instance, which is also recently was announced, and other different tools. So they it's not server side software, right? So you just install it on your laptop and start using. So they kind of bringing you know a new type of users to open source, which never used open source products before. I mean, there is a lot of, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that it's going to be, I mean, the mainstream, and but not of course not all products are good, for doing this, installing on your
Yeah.
laptop, but it's just kind of interesting. So how more, non-technical people are become exposed to open source kind of products.
Exactly. I think that's when you started talking about that. The first thing, kind of dropped in my mind was Ubuntu, right? I mean, that was kind of the first premise of Ubuntu, right?
First thing.
We should
Yeah.
we should give like an open source operating systems for the public, right? And that's going to be maintained by engineers, and everyone's going to love that, and it's going to be free. At the end of the day, I mean, obviously Ubuntu does have some sort of adoption. I've sometimes I've seen one Dell laptop with Ubuntu comes pre-installed, so I think that's something. But most often than not, when you targeting B2C and there's no engineers involved in there, there's nothing to actually gain from the open source. Now it's nice, it's being kind of distributed to other people, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be helpful for anyone else. Um,
Yeah,
so
I
I mean,
mean,
it's interesting.
yeah, it's definitely interesting. I'm not saying that it's, I
I
I, I would
think.
I would put a bet on it, but it's kind of just interesting. Yeah.
I mean, have you seen Medusa, the Shopper
Yeah,
open source
I did.
alternative? So I think that's really interesting idea. So traditionally speaking, e-commerce sites are being deployed by not necessarily technical people, because
Mhm.
commerce is a good understanding of of actual physical markets, and whomever can do that can generate a tremendous amount of revenue. So it doesn't necessarily mean you need to be technical by design. And we've seen that by WordPress and Shopper, and
Yeah.
all the other competitors kind of say, you know what, you can be kind of semi-technical, hire someone who is a bit more technical than yourself, and again, not necessarily extremely technical. There are a lot of WordPress engineers who are extremely technical, and others not so much, and everything is fine. You can still create amazingly working, revenue-driven e-commerce site. But Medusa kind of take it to the other level, saying, you know what, it's going to be open source. And for me, that's kind of an interesting motion, because you can see Medusa is growing by the day. So something is definitely working. And I think it boils down to be another infrastructure solution engineers are looking for, because they are, at the end of the day, the owners of the technical problems related to the business opportunities, whether that may be security opportunities, product opportunities, revenue opportunities. But at the end of the day, engineers becomes kind of an owners of this type of an infrastructure, and then they need to kind of grow it up. And
Yeah, I think talking about Medusa, there is there is another like force of open source which makes products to become open source, and I think it's about flexibility, extensibility. So with Shopify, you kind of very locked into their infrastructure, into their approach to UI and other things. And then you kind of this is what headless CMS for e-commerce websites trying to do. So
right,
they decouple backend from UI, yeah, and they allow you to create UI the way you want. And probably this is also where open source is very natural, because and Medusa probably trying to also follow this trend. So you're making Shopify much more extensible and
right.
than very yeah than the Shopify is.
I think generally speaking, when you can democratize some part of a product, and make sure the transition between the engineers and anyone else within the company are smoother, it's
Yeah,
it might be a good product to build. And specifically today, when companies, and now I'm going to talk specifically about B2B companies. No, actually, no, it's end company. When you need to kind of deliver more and more product, because
yeah,
the actual the actual minimal level becomes so high, then you as
Yeah.
a company need to deliver so much product, and a lot of those parts could be democratized, and a lot of those issues are actually engineers' issues. And so you can see more and more trends in open source motion, because more and more software need to be democratized into more engineers.
Hmm.
Yeah, and continuing a little bit about desktop apps. So I'm think that there should be some space for them, because I think they kind of they put the bottom up approach to extreme levels. So I mean,
Right,
probably everyone can start using it seamlessly, easily on their
right.
laptops, and this is kind of what Slack did in its early days, when you just single employee installs the app and some other friend installs the app, and then I don't it's really
Slack
depends on
isn't
the
really
product.
B2C, right?
Yeah, it's not
I think
B2C.
it's and when you're talking about, so I think maybe the distinction lacking here is about desktop, right? I mean, talking about desktop, are we talking about B2C or individual contributor getting the ability to start using some sort of a solution before transitioning into more of a product based need? Because Snyk did the
Yeah.
same, right? And Snyk isn't open source. It concluded as one of the best and biggest open source companies because it does leverage and work with open source quite nicely, but they're not actually open source or code available. And they're still able to give the single engineers a lot of capabilities, solving a lot of security needs within their company way before the company actually buy anything from Snyk.
Yeah, I think like for this desktop apps product, it's B2C is just a starting point. So I don't
Hmm.
think they would be able to monetize from B2C audience. So they
Mm,
eventually they all they would just bring this product into the company just before many people in the company using that, and then eventually make the company
mhm.
maybe to buy like the B2B version of this product, right? So I'm just I'm just theorizing a little about this. So this
Right,
products which I mentioned, they none of them yet already have like a B2B version, but I think
right.
they all want to go there, right? Yeah, not sure
Interesting.
how it really benefits them, but it's just interesting observation I wanted to share. Yeah.
Interesting.
Actually, it's really going straightforward to to our next kind of question subject, and it's of course more related uh, to the place you work right now, to RunaCapital, for instance. Um, and what I want you guys maybe to discuss a bit more is about how venture capitals or any investment in open source companies is actually taking place. I mean, what are the criterias? What are how those kind of investing firm look at open source companies? I know that Igor, you can say and talk about it from the perspective of the VC point of view, and Tomer, you can uh, think and share your perspective from the side that is actually raising funds. So it could be really interesting, kind of dance.
Happy to. No, so I think, and that's something that I'm not sure everyone is can agree about that, but that's
Yeah.
my perspective of the world is um, investors and founders ultimately try to work together and not against each other. And just like any other deal, you start by trying to find your best partner, the one who kind of have the same world views as yourselves.
Mhm.
Um, and so once you're able to find those, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to agree about everything, but at least you're going to have a big enough of a base to actually keep on the communication going. And so, looking on open source investors and open source founders, the big question would be: so, what are the metrics? What are you actually looking for? And again, depend on the actual type of product offering. Metrics can move quite big. So, just look at post hoc versus postman,
Yeah.
two very different type of products, very different types. And again, if you Igor, you just mentioned kind of a desktop type solution, perfect Postman example, right? I mean, that's how they did it, right? They started by, I used Postman for like years before I even realized there's a B2B offer there.
Yes.
For years, and I used it and I loved it. Um, and so I think that's one example. And obviously, there you're probably going to look more at adoption. And it's always going to be kind of a individual contributor adoption, because for the first couple of years, you can't accept anything other, because it's very kind of desktop related kind of solution. But looking into Posttalk, you can definitely say, these guys should ultimately, even within 2 years of running, should have some amount of proper companies using them. Now, it might not be, a Microsoft, but they should get a couple of, I would say, at least small to medium companies using them, because if it is a
Yeah.
B2B need.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
from the
absolutely.
from the investor, from a VC standpoint, probably the very first thing on investors looking at open source, I think, is adoption. I mean, adoption and contribution. I mean, because it's giving a star is an easy task, but contributing to a project is a much more
Yeah.
complicated stuff. Yeah, and yeah, trying to understand how many external contributors versus internal contributors, how involved the external contributors are. I mean, so for instance, if there are one-time contributors who just fixed something typo in README, and there are contributors who, I mean, created plugin, or there are people who reported 20 bugs. There's also these type of people are also contributors, and it's
Right.
important to look at different types of contributors and how they really involved in a
Hmm.
product. And another thing which we really always look into, is the strategy of open source products regarding free versus paid. So how the company structure it, what should be free, what should be paid, and why people would pay for what is paid. And
Hmm.
yeah, this is probably very important part of open source strategy. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think looking into, not sure if you mentioned this term up until now, cost commercial open source software,
Yeah.
We
but
haven't.
looking into,
No,
we
yeah.
haven't. So generally speaking, about open source companies trying to build an actual brand that is revenue based, cost commercial open source software. Looking into cost companies, their ability to not only grow a big open source community, but actually give them the ability to make it a sustainable business model. I think those questions becomes imperative, even if it's not the first year or second year. Given a couple of years, it must be thought of, because otherwise you're
Yeah.
just building a really expensive open source project,
Yeah, that's true. I mean,
VC backed open source project.
I, I mean, VCs, looking into open source investments, they don't demand, revenues from the beginning, because it's just crazy. I mean, but still, it's important to have some strategy about how you would monetize it in the future. Yeah, this is probably very, very important.
Can you elaborate a bit more on why you think it's crazy to ask specifically for more? I mean, the blank statement would be, as an investor, you always want to have the company to always have more revenue than nothing,
Of
right? So
course.
that's like a
Yeah.
blank statement. Of course, I mean, it takes down a lot of the risk, so it's easy. But specifically for open source companies, it tends not to be the case. And we've seen an example like Docker, right? They didn't have any revenue for years. But why do you believe a lot of good open source investors do not demand a revenue for the first 2, 3, 4, 5 years? And you could look at a lot of like Oasis Capital stating you should take
Yeah.
like 5 years before you actually get to revenue. Why do you believe that's the actual case?
I mean, investors are dreamers, and they believe that if a product has a big adoption, really adoption, and it becomes a kind of standard for in its niche, you probably can figure out how to monetize it. And I mean, it's not you should not overlook, monetizing it. So you just, spend everything on growing and growing adoption. I mean, but still, it's about risk, risk like portfolio of investors. So are you
Mhm.
do you believe that this product is going to be a market standard, and if this team can go, growing its adoption and not worrying about revenues? But I mean, not every investor is so bold to do such things,
Yeah.
allowing companies to not making revenues for 5 years. But still, for open source, it's natural to not worrying about revenues for first couple of years, but having a strategy beforehand.
Okay, I think it will be a great note to wrap up this amazing episode. We have so much to digest. I mean, right now I'm talking producer wise, but was really awesome that you came here, both of you today. And Igor, special thanks to you for participating and sharing your point of view and your knowledge, and for everything that you are doing. And Tomer, thank you again for being here for another episode and contributing so much to the conversation. Um, and thank you to all our listeners who came by another time. And we hope to see you here also next week. So thank you very much.
Amazing.
And thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having
Thank
me.
you. Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks.